Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Despot's Bookshelf. Now, we've received some feedback that in episode 1 it seemed a bit like I was reading from a script, which I absolutely was. In this episode I have no notes of note, and will simply explain that here we're going to be discussing On the Juche Idea, a speech given by Jong-il to mark and to celebrate his father, the great leader, Comrade Kim Il-sung. Now, when we spoke about Saddam, I tried to offer context on Saddam. All I'm going to say here is, this is mental. We know about North Korea, and we know that this is a foundational ideology of what is really probably the most insane state the 20th century and 21st century has ever seen. With me in this episode to discuss On the Juche Idea by Jong-il, I have Comrade Jack Bannon.
Hello, comrade.
Comrade Jack Carrington.
The better Jack, hi.
And Comrade Chris Whitworth.
Greetings, comrade.
Let's begin with probably the most foundational question, because we all know that Juche means broadly self-reliance. It's the ideology of self-reliance, an ideology that oddly manifested itself about the same time that no one wanted to support North Korea anymore. But Jack Carrington, you have some views that I may be pronouncing Juche wrong, do you not?
Well, I'm a very lazy person, and I find reading a difficult, troublesome and unenjoyable thing. So obviously I joined a podcast reviewing books. So what I do is I copy across from a PDF sourced online into a text-to-speech program, who then reads to me said thing in the early hours of the morning. So I have it reliably informed that it is pronounced Josh.
Well, we know how reliable those are. The documentary research that I've done has it pronounced Juche.
And tell us about your documentary research, Mr. Whitworth.
It was a sensationalist National Geographic or Channel 5 or, actually that's very different levels of quality there.
National Geographic, Channel 5.
Channel 5. It was sort of a balance between the two about evil dictators, and it's quite interesting just to get some tidbits about how insane the Kim dynasty, or dynasty as they kept pronouncing it, was. But the fact that it pronounced dynasty as dynasty probably says more about their pronunciation of Juche, or whatever Carrington said.
So we'll discount what you said there. Bannon, any views on this seminal topic?
Yeah, I'll be honest with you. I thought it was a book about jugs. So I was
you were grossly disappointed.
Profoundly confused by the work.
Bannon, what is Juche though? Tell the listeners.
I'll tell you what not. Finely made pottery.
I understand that at least one person has listened to this podcast to learn things, so let's try that again.
Here's how I interpret Juche, or as I would term it, jug ideology. Man is the master of the world, alright? Tick. Man must dominate nature, the revolution must continue to perpetuate itself, and the revolt can only really happen under the loving guidance of the party and the dear leader.
Yes, the master of the world element appeared a mere 17 times as a phrase. One thing we can say about this book, it is certainly on topic. Just the line, Juche idea, or Josh idea, appears 187 times. It's almost it's almost 1% of the entire book is just the phrase Juche idea.
It's so repetitive. It is kind of like those children's books that you get, which just use set phrases over and over again. Peter and Jane like being creative and independent. Peter and Jane have gone to North Korea. North Korea is creative and independent. Peter and Jane like North Korea.
But you can see the editor just sitting there with him, and he goes, so what I've basically said is I've said the Juche idea, and then I've gone on about creative and independence about 11 times in that paragraph. What do you think of that, Dave? And he goes, Oh, magic, that's absolutely spot on.
You know what I felt really sorry for when I was reading? When I was reading this, I felt so sorry for beavers.
Beavers?
Beavers, the animal.
Not the small Boy Scout.
Are you alright, Craver?
I am more than alright, Carrington. Literally, the whole book is about how humans are the only people who can change nature. A quote: all other material lives maintain their existence through their subordination and adaptation to the world. Do beavers not exist in North Korea? Do animals not make small dams? Do crows not make nests in North Korea? What is this nonsense conception? The North Korean ideology that humans are the only creatures which change the world felt like a genuinely idiotic sentiment, and it was a real contrast with the Saddam piece, I thought, because that is just stupid. At least Saddam appeared moderately coherent in his ramblings.
I was going to say, for a country so rich in natural resources, there's a denial about geological processes producing anything. It's the idea man is the only thing that changes anything. So you have no animals, no thing. Nature is just there to be conquered and exploited and used in some way. It was like Natalie Bennett would be having an absolute breakdown reading this.
I do think we're missing a key point in actually trying to define it, though, because Chris, I mentioned it at the start, but I'm going to put you on the spot here. What does Juche mean in English?
So in English, Juche means self-reliance or independence, and that really goes back to the 19th century. Korea was being referred to as the hermit kingdom because it had isolated itself from the rest of the world. So this isolation that we see in North Korea isn't exactly new.
So this is probably the origin of his particular distaste for what he regards as flunkyism, and any revolution or action that relies on sort of foreign armies and foreign power is the idea that, like, well, that's not a real revolution if you've got to have someone help you out, ignoring the fact that obviously Kim Il-sung was trained by the Soviets and the top half of the country was occupied by Soviet Union. But there is an obsession with the idea that it has to be domestic.
What I find funny about that is it's not only in the revolution, it's if you have a problem and a foreigner has an idea, you shouldn't take the foreigner's idea, because in that way you're not helping the revolution. What you need to do is go through the revolutionary Juche work method and create a Korean solution for the problem. And from what I gathered from the 8 paragraphs on the Juche work method were that what you've got to do is you've got to go, look at the problem and then work out how to fix it.
Revolutionary.
Kim Jong-il refers to Kim Il-sung, the eternal great president, still alive, of course. He discovered the truth of the Juche idea in the course of the struggle against bigoted nationalists and bogus Marxist, flunkiists and dogmatists. The level of... there's a viciousness there, as well as just maximal levels of irony that North Korea, of anyone, can have a go at dogmatists.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I love the notion that this is an anti-nationalist and anti-dogmatic piece of work, given the fact that it's foundationally all about nonsense dogma and nationalism. To try to provide a learning point for people, if you like, and please, I encourage anyone who's listening to this not to read this work. We truly, this week, more than nearly any other, we've read this because, so you don't have to. And I don't know who edited this, but the last 10 pages are just a repeat. I don't think anyone's ever read it in English before, and clearly that's never been flagged up. If you really wade through it, you will find that Juche is about 3 things. It is about independence in politics, self-sufficiency in the economy, and perhaps most importantly, self-reliance in defence. What I really liked, though, when you drill down, there's one quote which I found, and I will in a moment ask you all what you found most terrifying about this. In some ways it's rambly, but rambly in that sort of terrifying serial killer way. When he says the leader has put forward the task of revolutionising, working classising and intellectualising all members of society. How open-ended is that? And how easy is it to imagine working classising and revolutionising, meaning you're going to the gulag?
I mean, this is only a few pages on from where he uses the phrase opposition ideas will be liquidated.
When he gets into talking about education, he gets into some of the really eerie stuff. I really like the phrase, it's established the monolithic ideological system, which is like, shall I wrap this one in cotton wool? Now, balls to it. Monolith. Ideological system.
Bannon, are you going to apply the Juche work method to your professional life now?
If I ever stumble across a problem, I hope that I will be able to sort of observe it from a revolutionary ideological standpoint and then think about it in a good Korean way and then hopefully come up with a working class solution.
See, what I'm hearing there is that, Bannon, you are clearly a social being, 18 times, with independence, creativity and consciousness, 11 times.
Well, it's interesting that you talk about creativity there, Carrington, because as you will know well, a schematic viewpoint and a dogmatic way of thinking restrain creativity. So we should never think dogmatically in North Korea.
We've spoken about the definition, and I think we've touched upon the fact that this is lunacy. This is much more lunatic. I'm surprised to be saying this. This is much more lunatic than Saddam Hussein.
Can I just condemn you as an imperialist flunky, please?
I am. I'm overwhelmed with dogma, you see. I'm a dogmatic imperialist not following the Juche work method. But were I to follow the Juche work method, I would probably ask you all, was there anything actually clever or interesting in this?
I mean, there were some profound insights. I quite like the quote, "Man cannot, of course, live outside the world. He lives and conducts his activity in the world," which reminded me of the time Kim Kardashian put a map of the world on Instagram saying, "This is a map of the world, we all live here." And I think, yeah, thanks, Kim, both of you.
I was taken, but, well, there's many ironies in this. So in general, when it goes on about people should be free, they should be liberated, they should be independent, they should be creative, they should have initiative, there shouldn't be dogma. This is the thing about North Korea. It just doesn't believe in the concept of the individual. So when you're sent to the Gulag, which North Korea has the honour of having the highest proportion of its population in prison in the world. By the way, that's if you don't count the whole country as basically prison anyway. When you commit a crime, your entire family to 3 generations is punished as well. There is no concept of the individual. You're even punished collectively as if you are a pawn. You're a pawn of your family, you're a pawn of the state, you are a pawn of everything. There is no freedom in this state whatsoever.
What I thought was really interesting, though, and I think this is why I asked the question, in that wading through the insanity, wading through the really bad stuff, there were just slightly chilling undertones. Certain words that were used, I think, touched on why North Korea has become as it has. He defines this notion of the working classes, and he speaks about, the working class realisation, throwing off the shackles of oppression. But then there's always this little caveat, in that he speaks about how the advanced working classes need correct leadership, and they need correct guidance. And I would be really interested to know, Carrington, since you're word counting, how many times the word correct is used, as it's this great get-out clause. He speaks about how working classes should be free, but they need to be led in the correct way. They need the right sort of guidance, because, it's great that they're liberated, but...
Correct and correctly is a mere 50 times. By the way, if you would like to know the substantial word that appears the most often, you can get 157 independences and 92 independents from this text. As a concept, the one that is most ironic for the thing that you do not have as a citizen, it is the one that's referred to most. I've got an interesting, what I think might be an insight into a particular North Korean dictator that may have grown up on these sorts of ideas or had them repeated to him. It kept going on just like, well, man is clearly the most superior being in the world. We know that. Therefore, they are the most important thing. So it's the idea that might makes right. So the idea that, well, I'm the most powerful person in this country, so who matters most? If you've got that sort of mindset that there aren't higher principles beyond who is the most powerful, who is the most this, who is the most that, you can just really run with it and start doing horrific things.
I'm going to slightly disagree with you there, Carrington, and say that in the Jug ideology, I think they build in the party and the eternal leader as fundamental. So they say, and I think this is a direct quote, the policy of the party is the guide to revolution. So while I understand what you're saying about might is right, not all might is right. The might of the party, i.e. us and only us, is the correct guide to the revolution.
Well, I'm going to leap to Carrington's defence here. I agree with the point that Kim Jong-il was one of the few people in history, if only, to have actually been bred to be a dictator, raised to be a dictator. This is a man who's grown up with no rules, no guiding hand. He, at the age of about 7, he and his brother were playing in the swimming pool, and somehow his brother ended up being drowned. And not only did he show no remorse for this, yeah, I agree with your air quotes there, Van. Not only did he show no remorse, but it was seen as a birth myth of the great leader, or the second leader, that you don't mess with him because, this is a man who's willing to murder his own brother while he's still a child. And so Kim Jong-il portrayed this image of austerity and that he would only have one suit and live on only one ball of rice a day, to the point that he ceased to defecate.
What a miserable origin story that is, the notion of not defecating. A life with no satisfaction there. Very, very, very sad.
I found one of the weird things, that the fact that he was actually raised in China.
Who, Kim Il-sung? Yeah,
Kim
that
Il-sung.
was my point. He couldn't read Korean, could he?
No, he actually spoke so little Korean that his speeches had to be translated by the Soviets before he recited them. This comes from the fact he was born in China. And so the founder of this great Korean ideology hardly spoke the language.
And I quote, "Koreans must know well Korean history, geography, economics, culture, and the custom of the Korean nation, and in particular our party's policy."
It is an ideology of convenience, though. Don't forget. This is ultimately an attempt, or my read of it is, it's an attempt to oppress the masses. It's an attempt to legitimise oppression. And it's an attempt to legitimise, and correct me if I'm wrong, the only hereditary communist dictatorship that the world's ever seen.
It's sort of a survival of the fittest, and Kim Jong-il was brought up to rule to an extent. He didn't have any military service, so he had to convince the military of a hard man image. But he also had to make sure that his father had only one choice to name a successor. And to do that, he actually began spying on his own father. He bugged the supreme leader's palaces and made sure that anyone who was being considered were removed from the succession.
God, you'd be sweating if you were given that job, wouldn't you? If you were asked to bug the supreme leader's house in a state well known for its elaborate execution mechanisms. I do think there was one actually interesting bit in this. Having read it, if I put on my political philosophy hat, the only thing I thought that actually had merit was this notion that Juche needs to be a thing because socialism needs to be applied in context. And I thought his reflections on why all of the communist states in Eastern Europe fell really suddenly, or were in the process of falling, because they'd just taken the Soviet model and applied it without reflecting the national characteristics of Hungary or Germany or wherever, was actually slightly interesting.
I find it interesting that you've said that, because I thought that rather than that being a profound reflection on socialism, it's more an acceptance of North Korea's difficult position, where it doesn't really have strong allies. It has very little arable land. It has a very powerful enemy up against it. And I thought the Juche ideology is trying to make the best of a very difficult situation. And I think that links into this stuff about military self-reliance. And he said some really intense things about you can overpower an imperialist military threat through peerless self-sacrificing spirit and mass heroism, which for me means running into machine guns.
I don't necessarily disagree, but I think it was at least an attempt to offer an intellectual basis. It was an attempt to offer an analysis. And I go back to what I said right at the start. I believe this is an ideology of convenience. This is an ideology to take a very poor state, which, as you say, lacks much in the way of natural resources, lacks much in the way of arable land. This
is a resource-rich state. It's got coal, it's got that, like...
Yeah, coal, that desirable thing.
The southern part of the peninsula was deemed to be the poor, underdeveloped cousin, in the same way the developing countries now of sort of Africa, which are mainly agricultural, we go, they haven't got much.
And it's very interesting you say that, Carrington. You are completely wrong, of course, in your assessment. While North Korea may have coal, it's not, which is a declining commodity, declining in terms of value. What North Korea doesn't have is arable land. North Korea lacks much else by the way of resource, and I think this is ultimately an ideology about justifying oppression to propagate individual rule. I'm really interested to hear from you all, and I'll ask you to not elaborate on this, just let the listeners judge them on their own merits. If you could take a single quote from this work, what would your favourite quote be? And we'll start with Jack Bannon. What is your favourite single sentence from this entire literary horror show?
For me, it was an easy one. It's, the Juche idea has become an accepted contemporary thought.
Chris Whitwood.
I went for a similar one. The Juche idea, which elucidates the world outlook of a new age, is fresh and unique in its philosophical principle that forms its foundation.
And Jack Carrington.
It is simply the quote that apparently it is capitalism that depends on hunger and the rod.
So last week we discussed Saddam Hussein's book, and I think we concluded, and please feel free to correct me if you think this is a misread, that Stam's book was sadly actually not as insane as it could have been, and it was slightly more dangerous than that. It reflected, it was indicative of someone who'd thought quite a lot about how he could oppress people, and I believe we awarded it a basket case rating of 2 out of 5. I'll start with Bannon. What's your overall assessment of this?
I'm going to say that Kim Jong-un is more of a basket case than Saddam. My rating is 3 baskets for this work, and that is because of the total lack of an editor, either that or an editor with a severe addiction to amphetamines. Some very chilling comments about self-sacrifice and re-educating people, and some really truly bizarre comments about nature and the inability of anything in nature to alter anything else.
A strong 3 out of 5 from Jack Bannon. Chris Whitwood, your views?
Oh, it's just drivel, isn't it? It just repeats the same thing so many times without actually adding any more detail. I'm going to have to go for a 3 just on... It may have had some crazier ideas in there, but I couldn't get to them because it was just so dire and hard work to read.
Hard to read, and a 3 out of 5 from Chris Whitwood. Jack Carrington?
This speech is entitled On the Juche Idea, or Josh, if you like my text-to-speech program, and it mentions it 187 times. It's on topic. But as for just a stream of consciousness insanity, it's not that far out there. It's just mostly a bit wrong and incredibly repetitive. So I would give it a pie basket. Yeah, 3.14.
Pie? What nonsense. Yes, we know what pie is. This is an educated podcast with an educated audience. Thank you, Carrington. So 3 from Carrington as well. So my score doesn't really matter. I actually also was going to give it a 3. Poorly written, rambling, chilling lack of understanding of irony for me is what came out here. That would be my ultimate read, in that this is a book which talks about valuing individual freedom and creativity. This was delivered in 1982 after 35 years of systematic oppression, verging on murder of their own population. And despite all of that, with a straight face, this work was delivered about the value of individuality, and I find that slightly scary, actually. I actually have found in the book a section where it speaks about individual autonomy. However, about 5 minutes ago, I grew so tired of this work, I threw it in the bin and don't want to get it back out. So I would suggest, on that note, we thank our listeners for listening. If you got through, we're all very appreciative, and we say goodbye until next time. So it's goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
I am leaving now. Goodbye.
Goodbye, both of you.
And we will speak to you all again soon.